Listen closely, because the next 8 seconds were never meant for public ears. A man in 1861 believed dead, embalmed, and sealed beneath 6 feet of frozen Massachusetts earth woke up, not in time to save himself, but in time to leave a message, not written in ink, not whispered in confession, but carved into the world with the only tools he had left, his fingernails. And what he carved wasn't on wood or stone. It was carved into his own post-mortem photograph from behind the image, a message only visible when a doctor tilted the plate under lamplight. Thin, frantic scratches, like a man clawing through reality itself, begging anyone to understand what had been done to him. You were never supposed to hear this part, because what happened to Thomas Copeland was not an accident, and what his brother did afterward was not grief. It was research. But before you decide what to believe, before you choose which version of yourself walks away from this video, allow me to take your hand and pull you downward past the polite lies of history, past the comfortable myths we tell ourselves about sanity, medicine, and family loyalty, down into the cold chamber where truth is preserved like a specimen in alcohol. Frederick Copeland, Harvard-trained, respected, admired, did not flee his practice in shame. That's the myth, the safe version. The truth is far darker. He didn't run from what he'd done. He ran from what he discovered while doing it. You see, the Copeland brothers were not simply victims of a tragic misunderstanding or primitive medical practice. They were part of a pattern, a hidden current running beneath America's medical institutions in the 19th century. Men experimenting not on the sick, but on consciousness itself. Not to cure disease, but to break the barrier between the living mind and the silent world beneath it. What happened in his basement laboratory that winter was not one man pushing too far. It was a doorway opening. And once opened, it never closes quietly. So lean in, yes, you, because this is the part that changes you. This is where the descent begins. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to wake you. And every revelation after this will demand a piece of the person you thought you were. You need to understand something before we go any further, because if you miss this, you miss everything. Frederick Copeland wasn't searching for a cure. He was searching for control. The journals found a century later, hidden behind plaster, hidden behind shame, don't read like a doctor documenting seizures. They read like a man dismantling the human mind piece by piece, looking for the switch that separates life from death, consciousness from oblivion, surrender from resistance. Because Thomas wasn't just a patient. He was the perfect test subject, vulnerable, trusting, trapped by his own body. And Frederick, the brother who vowed to protect him, realized something terrible. A man on the edge of death reveals truths no healthy mind can access. The Copeland basement was not a laboratory. It was an altar. And Frederick was not a healer. He was a priest of a new, desperate religion, one where suffering was the scripture and Thomas was the sacrifice. Understand the context of 1861. America was tearing itself apart. Ideologies were colliding. Men were dying by the thousands in fields that smelled like rust and wet earth. The civilized veneer was cracking. Institutions, medical, political, religious, were losing their grip. In times like this, the ambitious don't retreat. They advance. They look deeper into the abyss than anyone else dares. Some fall. A few learn something. Frederick documented not just Thomas's convulsions but his expressions. The way his eyes followed invisible figures during hallucinations. The words he mumbled in states between seizure and sleep, names, places, phrases Frederick claimed he could not translate. He recorded changes in temperature around Thomas's body that had no medical explanation. Lamps dimming. Metal tools vibrating on the table. He wrote calmly, coldly, that neurological storms may thin the veil between the patient and the realm beyond waking. This was not medicine. This was trespass. Neighbors heard screams in the night, but Frederick always had an explanation. Delirium, pain, the fits. But the screams they heard were not the screams of a man dying. They were the screams of a man realizing he was no longer being treated, he was being taken apart. And now that you've followed me this far, I want you to prove something to me and to yourself. Right now, type this phrase in the comments twice. I descend because I choose to. It marks the moment your transformation begins when you stop observing this story and start owning it. Now that you've committed, type the phrase, anchored your awareness. Listen carefully, because this is where most people stop. They can't handle the next layer. But you're not most people. You chose to descend. On February 27, 1861, Thomas Copeland's seizures had escalated into something Frederick would later call cataclysmic. The convulsions were longer, more violent, leaving Thomas unconscious for hours. But Frederick didn't panic. Not yet. He had spent months refining a cocktail of plant alkaloids: willowbark, belladonna, digitalis, and something far rarer, derived from an obscure European root known to induce paralysis without death. The formula was dangerous. Every dose could have been lethal. But Frederick believed that in the fine line between consciousness and oblivion lay the solution. A controlled death, reversible, a bridge between suffering and what? Control, liberation, or something darker. He administered the compound. Thomas fell into a silence so profound. Frederick initially thought his brother had died. But the journals reveal something terrifying. Thomas's pupils didn't simply dilate, they shattered, as Frederick described. Not physically, but perceptually. The light, he wrote, passes through them as though through a veil. He sees beyond, and screams, though his mouth moves not. Frederick recorded the screaming minute by minute, hour by hour. He noted the temperature changes in the room, the subtle tremors in the walls, the clock hands moving irregularly. Every observation, every line in the journal, is clinical, but beneath the ink lies obsession. Beneath the science lies something primal. A man attempting to map the threshold between life and a realm no one is meant to enter. By evening, Frederick panicked. Thomas had not regained normal consciousness. He had not died. He was trapped, somewhere in the abyss. And Frederick, in his journals, admits, he considered interring his brother temporarily buried beneath the frost to study the effects of total isolation and sensory deprivation combined with his compounds. The very thought chills the mind because Frederick rationalized it as research, a necessary step to save him. This is the point most historians omit. They speak of Thomas's death as tragic misfortune. They speak of Frederick as a grieving doctor. The reality is more insidious. Frederick Copeland was walking the edge of a forbidden science, the deliberate manipulation of consciousness, life, and perception. A man using love as the veil for an experiment that would be remembered, but misinterpreted. And remember, what you're hearing now is a fraction of the horror. The scratches in the photographs, the journals, the hidden compartments, these are breadcrumbs left for those bold enough to follow. This is where the story becomes unbearable, and that is exactly why it was buried. Not in soil, but in memory. Not in a coffin, but in history itself. Frederick Copeland, after hours of observing Thomas's suspended state, made a choice. A choice that would define him and forever stain the Copeland name. He did not panic. He did not seek help. He did what he had been building toward in secret. He prepared the burial. But not a normal burial. A controlled interment. A temporary entombment designed to test the boundaries between paralysis, death, and awakening. He placed Thomas in a coffin lined with soft pine, secured the lid, and noted in his journal, with chilling precision, the time of interment. The purpose was scientific, or so he wrote, to observe the body's responses over time, to measure the mind's resilience when cut off from all external stimuli, to study the veil between conscious and unconscious, the threshold no human was meant to cross. What Frederick could not know, or perhaps he did, and it drove him further, was that the human mind cannot be fully contained, cannot be fully observed without consequence. Hours later, he heard faint noises, thuds, scratches, muffled sounds beneath the frozen ground. He panicked as any man would, and yet he recorded it clinically. Minute 42, sounds of clawing. Minute 47, breath uneven. Minute 53, muffled vocalization resembling speech. Minute 61, resistance escalating. Frederick faced a paradox. To continue the experiment meant risking his brother's life or what was left of it. To halt it meant abandoning the hypothesis that had consumed him for months. In that tension, he glimpsed the darkest truth of all, that in trying to control life, he had become a warden of death. And this is where the scratches in the photographs make sense. They are not artistic accidents, not superstition. They are Thomas's fingerprints reaching through the thin veil of whatever state Frederick had placed him in. A desperate communication, a signal from the threshold that humans are not meant to breach. The town, oblivious to the horror, continued its daily routines. Children running through snow, church bells tolling, women gathering by the river. And above it all, Frederick Copeland performed the unthinkable under the guise of science, morality, and brotherly love. A reminder that evil does not always wear fangs, it can wear a lab coat, speak gently, and carry the veneer of necessity. This is the kind of knowledge that changes a man. Not softly, not like a whisper in the night. It reshapes your perception of trust, of authority, of love itself. Now we reach the point where obsession becomes madness, and love becomes a weapon. Frederick Copeland, having buried his brother alive or at least placed him on the knife edge between life and death, began to document not just the physiological effects, but the psychological consequences of his experiment. And this is where we see the true cost of forbidden knowledge. Frederick's journals, recovered a century later, reveal a man speaking to himself in fragmented sentences, arguing with invisible presences, and rationalizing actions that would shock even the most hardened observer. He noted Thomas's eyes beneath the coffin lid not always closed, sometimes blinking, sometimes rolling back in ways that suggested the mind was still awake, even as the body remained confined. He recorded every breath, every shudder, every tremor as if they were pages in a ledger, not signs of human terror. But Frederick did not stop at observation. He began experimenting with sound, light, and vibration, small interventions meant to test the boundaries of sensory perception in the living dead. A knock here, a whispered word there. A candle flame moved along the lid. He sought to determine whether consciousness could be trained to respond from the abyss, whether the human spirit could be coerced into communication when trapped between worlds. And here is the lesson the world never wanted you to learn. There is a difference between death and submission, between silence and compliance. Frederick's obsession was not merely to save his brother. It was to master him, to understand the ultimate mechanisms of human control, the switches, the triggers, the subtle corridors of fear and obedience. He wrote, "The body may be contained, the mind resists, yet the mind may be bent. One must understand the limits before bending the will." By the third day, Frederick's entries become erratic. Time collapses. He can no longer distinguish hours from minutes. He refers to Thomas as the subject, then as the vessel, then simply as it. Outside, snow falls over Milbrook, and the townspeople remain unaware of the horrors unfolding behind the clapboard walls. Inside, Frederick records sound scratches, muffled cries, whispers, proof that consciousness persists beyond the physical body, and that even the deepest isolation cannot erase awareness. This is the abyss, and this is why history hides it. Once you've seen how close a human can come to being erased and still leave a mark, you understand that control, absolute control, is an illusion. You also understand the terrifying responsibility of knowledge that is not meant for everyone. Halfway through, I want you to do something again. Comment this phrase twice to seal your descent and align your focus with the truths we are uncovering. I see beyond the veil. I accept the cost. Now we arrive at the turning point. This is where obsession devours reason, and the hunter becomes the hunted not by another human, but by the very knowledge he sought to command. Frederick Copeland had crossed the threshold. He was no longer a physician. He was a cartographer mapping the unknown landscape of life and death. But every map has its hazards, and Frederick was about to encounter them firsthand. By the fourth day of Thomas's interment, Frederick recorded phenomena he could not rationalize. The walls of the basement seemed to hum with low-frequency vibrations. The oil lamps flickered without draft, and shadows moved where none should exist. The scratches in the photograph, already haunting, were only the beginning. He began hearing Thomas's voice in whispers that weren't carried through the air. They emerged from the dark spaces of the room, the corners where light could not reach. Frederick documented these whispers with meticulous precision, as if writing down the lines of a play, unaware that the play was writing itself around him. And then, the first journal entry that chills the soul. The subject resists. I feel it pressing back. Not with force but with will. I have created a conduit I cannot control. Frederick, in his hubris, believed he could manipulate consciousness, bend it to his purpose, even suspend it between life and death. But here he realizes a truth no experiment can contain. When you tamper with the mind at its edge, the mind fights back and sometimes it wins. He tried to intervene. The alkaloid mixtures, the sounds, the vibrations, all attempts to maintain authority over the fragile threshold of Thomas's existence. But each effort seemed to strengthen what he could not see. Each measure of control became a measure of exposure. Frederick began to experience hallucinations himself. Figures appearing at the edge of his vision. Whispers echoing the phrases Thomas had once uttered in seizure. Eyes in the dark corners of the basement. And the scratches in the photographs, faint at first, multiplied. Like messages from a prisoner of consciousness, clawing through dimensions Frederick had no business entering. By this point, Frederick's mind had begun to fracture. The journals reveal a man who speaks to himself in multiple voices, debates ethics with shadows, and writes apologies to Thomas he would never deliver. He knew the townspeople, the laws, and the moral codes of 1861 would never comprehend the scale of what he had unleashed. And so, like all men who stumble too far into forbidden knowledge, he hid. He buried not just his brother, but the evidence, the proof, the horror itself. This is the stage where you must realize something crucial. Curiosity has a cost. Not everyone survives it intact. Not everyone retains the boundaries between what is permissible and what is irreversible. We are now in the final days of Frederick Copeland's Descent, the part of the story where morality, love, and science collide in a way that no history book will admit. After 4 days of his brother suspended between life and death, Frederick faced a truth too terrible to acknowledge. He had gone beyond helping. He had become the instrument of his own obsession, and Thomas was no longer just a patient, a brother, or even a human being in Frederick's eyes. He had become an experiment, a mirror reflecting Frederick's deepest fears and ambitions. On the 5th day, Frederick's journals describe a confrontation that no outsider could witness. The scratches in the photograph intensified, lines spiraling like frantic fingerprints. He wrote, "I see the struggle. I feel it pressing upward, reaching. I am no longer master here. The threshold is not mine to command." The realization struck him like a physical blow. Consciousness, human, unyielding, relentless, refuses to be contained. His formulas, his instruments, his calculations useless against the will of a mind determined to survive beyond the coffin, beyond the substance, beyond his control. At some point that night, Frederick made the choice that would define the horror of his legacy. He documented it with mechanical precision, yet beneath the ink lies terror. He decided to exhume Thomas, to lift him from the pine coffin and study the body, the mind, the conduit he had created. He described the effort as delicate, clinical, necessary. But the truth is darker. Frederick sought to reclaim dominion over what had already slipped from his grasp. He was chasing the ghost of control, and ghosts, unlike men, are patient and merciless. When he opened the coffin, he found what no man should ever see. His brother, alive, eyes wide and staring, hands clawing at the lid as though trying to escape the very reality Frederick had imposed. The screams that followed were not simply terror, they were communication, protest, accusation. Frederick wrote that the sound shook the walls, rattled the glass, and seared the soul. In that moment, he understood the cost of arrogance. The experiment had become a reckoning, and the reckoning had a voice. It is here, in the sound of those screams and the scratch marks left in silver and pine, that we confront the ultimate lesson. Forbidden knowledge does not merely reveal truth. It demands payment, and those who try to command life, consciousness, or death without reckoning will discover that the universe always collects its debt. If you have followed this far, your perception has already begun to shift. You have glimpsed what most will never see. And now, in the final section, We descend fully into what became of Frederick, the man who sought mastery, and the shadow he left behind. Now we reach the end of the descent. This is where history, horror, and human ambition converge into a truth so dark that it has been hidden for over a century. Frederick Copeland survived his experiment, but only as a man hollowed out from within. He left Milbrook quietly, his reputation intact, his deeds buried beneath layers of secrecy. But the journals, the photographs, the scratches they endured, they whispered across time, waiting for someone daring enough to uncover them. Frederick lived the rest of his days in isolation, haunted not by guilt alone, but by knowledge too vast and too forbidden for ordinary minds. He understood what no doctor should ever understand, that human consciousness, once tampered with at the threshold between life and death, leaves permanent marks. Marks not just on the body, but on the soul of the observer. He became a recluse, obsessed with correspondence to European scholars who may have suspected, but never confirmed, the depth of his research. The hidden journals, eventually found in 1963, reveal a man who knew the cost of curiosity, who documented every tremor, every whisper, every shadow that emanated from the experiment, not for fame, not for legacy, but to warn those who might follow. Yet the most terrifying truth remains. Thomas Copeland, the brother, survived. In a way, he always did. But survival was not salvation. His mind had traversed a place no living man should go, a liminal space between existence and nothingness. The scratches in the photographs are proof of that journey, proof that even in confinement, even in what we call death, consciousness endures. Frederick's ambition opened a door, and once opened, it never fully closes. This is what forbidden history teaches us. Power over life is an illusion. Control over consciousness is fleeting. And knowledge that touches the boundaries of life and death comes with a price, often paid not in wealth or recognition, but in fragments of sanity, morality, and human identity. Frederick Copeland was brilliant, yes, but brilliance without restraint, without respect for the natural limits of the human mind, becomes monstrous. The scratches on silver, the whisper of a man trapped between worlds, the journals hidden for generations, all of it reminds us that history is not written for the curious. It is written for the survivors. And now you have survived the descent with me. Take a moment, breathe. Understand that what you have seen is not fiction. It is a caution, a map of a human abyss few dare to traverse. And remember, those who seek forbidden knowledge are changed forever. The door is open, the veil is thin, and now you know the cost of stepping through. Dare to descend? Comment the symbolic phrases twice when prompted. Subscribe for more forbidden knowledge, and unlock the truths the world tried to bury. Every comment you leave marks your initiation into hidden history. Don't just watch. Become part of the story.